Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Shervington. I'm the Senior Commissioning Editor at SCM Press. It's really good to have the opportunity to talk to you a bit today in this session I'm calling A User's Guide to a Publisher's Brain. There'll be a little bit of an opportunity for questions and answers later. I don't know if you've seen, but if you go to sly.do, if you type that into your address bar on your browser and then put in hashtag SCM Press as the event name, you can send me questions. So I'm hoping there'll be a few questions by the time we've finished. Also, apologies for the massive headphones, which are only here so that I can hear the amazing people somewhere up north who are doing all the technical side of this. I'm going to talk mostly this afternoon about academic publishing, though in theology, the lines between academic and practice get a little bit blurry. But what I want to help you understand a bit today is what we as publishers are looking for in a book. What are our priorities? What is going on in our heads? And why ultimately might we say no when you come to us with a project? And how do you make sure that we say yes? And I'm going to set things out particularly for early career researchers. That's partly because you're at the start of your academic career, and I think there's particular pressures. But also it's because I think you've got really fresh, exciting ideas, and I want to encourage and explore that a little bit. We do, some of you will have noticed, we do an event called Theology Slam each year. And one thing we've really noticed is that it's an amazing way of finding kind of hidden talent in theology, people who have got exciting, quite groundbreaking ideas, and to give them a platform. And in a way, that is just a little snapshot of what we're trying to do all the way across what we're doing as a publisher. Because basically, for early career researchers, what you need us, because we are able to give you a little bit potentially of a platform. We're able to engage with the kind of people that you want to get your research out to. But also we kind of need to have a relationship with you, because you are, our main purpose really is to be able to try and see around the curve to find out what's coming next. Of course, that's a little bit of a balancing act. If we go too far ahead of the curve, we get into niche areas that people aren't going to be interested in beyond your own small bubble potentially yet, although hopefully further down the line that'll change. But if we stay too far behind the curve and we just jump on any kind of bandwagon, then we don't publish books that are going to sell. So you're really important, because you're exactly where theology is going, hopefully, in what you're doing. So I think this is a really important relationship, the one that publishers have, particularly with early career researchers. It's a kind of symbiotic thing, and I think it's really important. So the first thing we need to be thinking about is what are the big questions to be asking, and what are the big issues? And I think the first issue that we need to be thinking about is why do you want to publish your thesis as a monograph? Because that is a real kind of brass tacks question, and I think a lot of people leap straight to, I need to get my research out as a book. I think there are some good answers and some bad answers as to why you might want to get your research out as a book. And here's a good answer, because I want my research to meet a new audience. That might be practitioners, that might be incumbents, that might be ordinands, that might be students, that might be research scholars, it might be all sorts of people. But the fact is, a monograph reaches a completely different audience from your original research. A bad answer as to why you might want to get your research published. Well, because I want to make money. The sad truth of the matter is, and we might sort of touch a little bit later on the economics of publishing, but the sad truth of academic publishing in particular is that there are not huge royalties in it for you as an author. There may be some royalty. In our case, we would offer you some royalty and various other things, for example, discounts on buying books and that sort of thing. But I really wouldn't recommend publishing a book on the basis, particularly if it's your first book and you're an early career researcher. I wouldn't recommend publishing a book on the basis that you're going to be able to make a living out of it. I feel like it's always worth just bursting that bubble right at the beginning, because it is really important that we're very straight about what kind of publishing this is. The point is that even theology, even if you were publishing a book that did very well within theology, that would still be a reasonably niche area. It might be very, very popular for your target market, but it's still only going to be maybe 800, 1,000, 1,500 people if it's doing really well. Those sorts of numbers are not going to give you the opportunity to earn huge amounts of money. So there's a potentially a bad answer as to why you might want to get published, I'm afraid. But a good answer would be as a step on the ladder. If you publish once with a publisher and they like the book and it sells and the relationship with you and your editor is a positive one, you might find it easier to publish a second time. Publishers, thrive on relationships. Part of the reason that I went into this job is purely out of a love of meeting people, hearing their work, listening to what they have to say, and having a coffee with them and just hearing about what fires them up. And most other publishers, I think, will probably say the same thing. It's that relationship that's really important. So as a step on the ladder, both in terms of giving you a kind of platform for your work, but also potentially building to something bigger in future. So even a standard hardback research monograph will have that potential to be a sort of stepping stone. So let's assume as we move forwards that you do decide that you want to publish your research in some way. You've been through the good and bad answers, and you still think publishing is the way forward. Well, let's have a think about some of the questions that you ought to be asking yourself. First question that I think is really important to ask is this: is my research best presented in book form? And you will be the best person to answer that question. But would it perhaps be better published as a series of journal articles? Now, the obvious advantage with a journal is you already have a sort of a lined up group of readers. People subscribe to journals, libraries subscribe to journals. You don't have to do all that legwork in terms of getting the message out there that this is coming. So you have a sort of ready audience. That's something that's really worth considering, although it pains me to admit that journal publishing is a way forward. Do have a look through all sorts of different ways of publishing. Obviously, I think there's a lot to be said for books, but I do also think that sometimes I'm saying to authors, you know what, this particular idea would work best, at least to test the water as a journal article, but potentially. So let's assume you've chosen to publish your research as a book. That might be the first option, a research monograph or a more accessible book. So sorry, yes, I didn't give you kind of a lowdown there. There are two potential ways you might want to publish a book. There's a research monograph, which will arrive in libraries and be really useful at sort of trickling down the research into places that it needs to go. But secondly, a more accessible book, and I'd say particularly with theology, particularly in terms of practice, that there's a potential that books might be used by people, for example, ministers or pastorally in all sorts of ways like that. In fact, I would say both of those ways, although it may feel sometimes like a hardback monograph is something that is quite an easy transformation, particularly from, say, a PhD project, that is not always the case. There is actually a lot of work required in both of those instances. so we're going to sort of unpack a little bit as we go forward. What are some of the considerations in terms of both of those approaches? And I'll be referring as we go on to both of those ways of publishing. The first thing I think to think about as you explore different publishers for either of those books, the research monograph or the popular book, is where best is a book placed? Now, it might sound like a really fundamental question and something that's fairly obvious, but actually, you'd be amazed at the number of book proposals I get for books that are clearly not quite right for our list. I would say a first thing you want to be doing is going to a website, having a look at the different kinds of books that are being published, and just being aware of what is happening. There may be advantages to publishing with a publisher that has a lot of different disciplines that it's focusing on. So some of the larger publishers will do that. But there might also be some advantages to going to a more specialist press. And I think weighing up those two different options, having a look again on the website, just seeing the kind of books that they're publishing, and having a think about the kind of markets that you want your book to reach. Have a think about what kind of distribution they have. Are you happy for your book to be only available in the UK? Or is there a strong need to make it available in an overseas territory? In terms of SCM, we UK based, but our biggest market is the UK because of the growth of print on demand, and it's easier than ever really for us to push our books out in worldwide. So have a look at the publisher. Are they able to make books available internationally? We work with a US partner, Westminster John Knox, and for example, in the US, if you were to buy one of our books, you'd go via them, and that gives us a real sort of presence and the ability to kind of make an impact across that particular market. Think about other kinds of distribution, other kinds of edition of books. Will the book be available as a ebook? Will the book be available once the first run sells through? Will it be available print on demand? Lots of publishers now go almost straight to a print on demand model, where essentially books aren't printed and shipped in large, with sort of a few hundred copies printed. They're almost printed bespoke, and there's lots of advantages to doing that. As I say, one big advantage of print on demand is that it means that at the touch of a button, a book is available, at the other side of the world. So there are big advantages to those sorts to publishers getting on board with those sorts of technologies. One word of warning, and something worth asking of the publisher, again, having a look on the website and just checking, does the publisher ask you to pay anything up front? Now, there may be some costs, of course, costs related to potentially indexing, or if you've got something in your book that requires huge sort of permission fees, for example, poetry or images. But those are sort of a given, and there are costs for authors sometimes in those. But the real question is, does the publisher require you to pay something upfront simply to publish the book? There are publishers out there that will look for that, and there may be advantages, but I'd say, I would hope that your research would be strong enough actually that doesn't really need that sort of incentive for the publisher to publish, and if it does need that sort of incentive for the publisher to publish, you might want to go back to that question. Is there something fundamentally about this research that doesn't make for a book that actually would work much better as a journal article, in terms of building yourself that platform and getting yourself on that ladder? Think about what the finished product would look like. I think cover designs are somewhat neglected by a lot of publishers, and that's not a kind of approach we take really. We're quite careful to work with the author and do some really good really good, convincing, attractive cover designs, making things look good. And we're kind of aware. I'm certainly kind of aware of that moment when you, as the author, first pick up your book, and the idea that you might actually want to be proud of it. I have a book within reach, thankfully. So here's a cover design we did recently, reimagining mission from urban places. And this is an image that was supplied by the author. And there was a bit of toing and froing with the author, Anna Ruddick, on that book. But I think actually the result is a really good looking book. Is there that possibility of producing a book that you're actually going to be really proud of? Because I think there's a lot to be said for that. Have a think about what the publishing priorities seem to be. Each publishing imprint will have its own particular strengths. And do those areas, those strengths, tie up with your own work? Our particular focus at SCM recently has been thinking about publishing which engages at some level with the preoccupations of church and with wider society. We want our list to do that sort of so what stuff. So have a think about, in your case, how well does your work fit with those kinds of priorities? Have a look at the backlist. Get familiar with what they've already published. I would say all publishers evolve, so don't look at the backlist and then say, well, that's what the publisher does. Because if you're looking 20, 30, 40 years ago, the publisher will probably have changed their focus and their priorities, but do have a look, see the sorts of things that they've published in the past. So let's assume you've chosen your publisher, you're getting ready to make your initial approach. So what do you need to do? I want to introduce you to Lisa. Now, Lisa successfully defended her thesis 6 months ago. Since then, she's been enjoying normal life. She's been remembering what it's like to see people, although not at the moment, obviously. She's fed her cat for the first time in 4 years, and the cat no longer looks starved. She's remembered that, in fact, she has a husband. It's a very happy time for Lisa as she finishes this bit of research. So as things start to calm down a bit for Lisa, after a bit of a breather, she approaches me with a book proposal. In fact, she approaches me simply just to say, look, I've done this thesis and I'm interested in getting it published in book form. She's done that work about thinking about whether it's best placed as a book or as a journal. And she's decided to approach SCM with this particular idea. And so at this stage, all I have is her thesis. And so as I look at it, I notice that it is about a particular group of environmental campaigners, who Lisa's been studying at close quarters. And she's been thinking about how they use biblical and theological language in their campaigning. By the way, I made this up a couple of years ago in the hope that someone might pick this up as a research project. As yet, I know nobody who's done this, but I think this would be really a very interesting project. But anyway, so typically of a thesis, it's structured around a central research question. It includes an extensive literature review, a discussion of definitions and terminology, consideration of scholarship around theology and creation care, large sections on research design methodology, those sorts of things. So it's all the mechanics, really, of a thesis. So the first thing I can say from the word go is, you know what, broadly, this does fit with our publishing priorities. We're talking here about something that engages with a theology, with a real world context. There's a lot at the moment to say about climate change. And it's a particular theme that in my head, when I see a proposal that sort of sits around this area, I'm thinking, well, this looks interesting. I can also see a couple of points of concern. And those points of concern are mostly around, you know, can we make this book viable? As I said earlier, you know, we at the end of the day, this might feel very mercenary, but we do need, if the book is going to work for us, we need to be able to have the confidence that we can sell copies. In this case, Lisa's talking very specifically about a group of campaigners. I'm going to say, I'm just going to throw in an extra curveball. It's also fairly geographically limited. So that, say it's just in, I don't know, the northeast of England or whatever. And so, so that creates a certain potential difficulty. So we're just going to bear that in mind as we move forward. Lisa said to me that she wants to go down the academic monograph route. Partly this is particularly because she's aware of these limitations of the study, and she doesn't feel, she's aware that an academic monograph is maybe a year's extra work on top of the PhD. That's being a little generous, really, maybe a year and a half. If she was going to turn this into something that's really practitioner focused, something a bit more popular, she might be looking at 3 years. She's only just rediscovered her cat. The cat does not want to go unfed for another 4 years or 3 years or whatever it is. So she decides to go down the academic monograph route. There's still going to be lots to do, even in an academic monograph. She's not going to want to include the literature review, the methodological stuff. Some of that can go within an introduction, but it probably needs to be a little bit edited. There's going to be a lot of work for her still to do. And I think probably what she's going to need to do is take us on a journey towards her practical implications, much as a thesis might often do, actually. Now, as an aside, if she was going to go for the more accessible book, I suspect she might start at the end. So she might start with those more practical questions and then go forward, which is why it would take so much longer, because actually that's an awful lot more work. So assuming Lisa isn't totally put off by the level of work involved, maybe either an extra year of tweaking or 3 to 4 years of rewriting, her next step is going to be to put together a proposal. This is a really important document because this is the first time I get to really understand how this is all working in Lisa's brain. We talk about your guide to my brain, but also I need my guide to your brain in the form of the proposal. So I've seen the PhD, I've seen the research, but this is where it becomes really obvious how you want to take this work and make it into a book. So that proposal, even for a research focused scholarly monograph, is really important. The other thing to bear in mind that I think is often forgotten is that even, certainly in our organisation, even a research focused scholarly monograph has to go through a process not only of academic review but also internal conversation within our internal editorial board. That involves my marketing colleague. It involves various other people, salespeople, and other people involved in the process. And it's really important that you're aware of that as you put this proposal together, because you're not just writing anymore for your dissertation examiner or whoever it might be. You're writing for a much bigger audience. In a sense, you're selling the project to me. And so as you put that proposal together, please bear that in mind. You're communicating to people who are always thinking in the back of their mind, yes, but will this book sell? And you've probably never thought like that about your research before. And that's probably quite an uncomfortable thing. And I do completely understand that's an uncomfortable thing. If you've spent years on this research, you're very closely involved with it, and suddenly you're having to think about it in this sort of monetized way. But it is really important for us that we can make the book work for us. So you need to be aware of that in your proposal. So let's have a think about the specifics of what Lisa needs to include in that proposal document. And we're talking here about maybe a Word document, nothing more fancy than that. We do have guidelines. If you go to our website, you'll find guidelines, or drop me a line and I can talk you through this bit in more detail. But broadly, this is what the kind of things that you'll need to be including. So firstly, a general rationale for the book. This is your sort of fleshing out of why does the book exist? What is important about the book, and do we need it? Uh, and just sort of almost think of it like a story. Almost think about, if you were summarizing a story, then what would that look like? A statement on your expected audience. So be as clear as you can about who your expected audience are. I've lost count of the number of proposals I've looked at where the audience has been something like general readers, or the intelligent laity, or thinking Christians, and we all have faith that there are such people, that are thinking Christians, but it's too broad an audience, really. We need you to be more specific than that. What we're looking for is what kind of areas is your reader interested in? What do they do? Are they practitioners? Are they chaplains? Or are they from a particular academic discipline? Are they practical theologians? But on the flip side, there's a bit of a kind of litmus test here, because if you've had to drill down too far, if you said, you know what, this book proposal is perfect for somebody who knows about a really obscure Swedish theologian who lived in the 1800s and came from this small town, and had sort of five people he influenced, alarm bells are going to be ringing in my head, because I'm thinking, well, we've gone from having a massive market to having far too small a market. So actually, I'm hoping that the process of thinking about who your reader is really critical. In fact, I often say that is the first thing to do, in a way. So that particular section of your proposal form should give you a sense of whether you've really been able to think about that. The other thing, of course, is to think about the level. Are you thinking about practitioner? Are you thinking about something that's textbook student friendly? Are you looking at somebody, postgrad research? So think about level, both in terms of breadth, where it sits within the kind of grand scheme of the disciplines, but also level in terms of is it a textbook, or is it a research monograph? Give me a brief review of the existing literature and your sense of the place of the book within it. Again, this is a useful litmus test, because if you're saying that there are lots and lots of books that have been written about this, but there's nothing that distinguishes your book, then that rings alarm bells in my head. If you're saying there has never been a book written anything remotely around this, then although that may be attractive, it also may be quite a sort of worrying thing, because you think, well, why has somebody not written about this before? It might be because there's nothing to sort of say. So, those are just some of the thoughts going on in my head. And an expanded list of contents. This is really important, again, because what this gives me is your sort of idea of the shape of the book. It doesn't need to be final. I'm not going to hold you to that. If you've given me a contents list, I'm not going to sort of hold it up against the final manuscript and say, well, you didn't do this, this, and this, as long as you've kind of kept me informed of the process. But it does give me a chance to sort of hear your sense of how this thesis thing is going to become a book thing, and what sort of journey you're going to take us on through that, even within an academic monograph, really. And a sort of potted summary of each book is each chapter is really helpful. So not a long list of subheadings, not huge chapter headings that kind of do the whole work of the chapter within the chapter heading, nothing like that. Just a sort of summary of each chapter is really helpful. Think of it as a sort of fantasy contents. If you're going to write this book, this is the contents I would choose to have. And also a brief CV. One thing I haven't really covered is that one of the factors in my head as I'm thinking about a book project is the author. I'm thinking about you. I'm thinking about whether you are connected to the right sort of the networks that are going to be able to push this book, even for something that's an academic research monograph. Are you speaking at the conferences that are relevant in this area? Do you have those sorts of opportunities? If you're doing something practitioner focused, are you able to go around different, I don't know if it's a church thing, go around different dioceses and talk to people about this work? Or, are you involved in these different areas? I would say Twitter's really helpful. If you're on Twitter, if you have those kind of connections, that is helpful. What I wouldn't do is insist upon it. There are all sorts of very good reasons, very, very good reasons not to be on Twitter. But it is a useful barometer. I'm looking at your, I have to confess, looking at your followers, what sort of networks you're involved in there as well. And I'm thinking, and actually increasingly, I'm picking up book projects via Twitter. So it's useful to have those sorts of presences, although I don't feel that, particularly with social media, don't feel that it is a prerequisite. It certainly isn't. And there, as I say, there are very good reasons not to be on there. It's also a good idea to have a sample chapter or two. Now, I appreciate this is a bit chicken and egg, because you might be waiting for the certainty of a contract before you do a chapter. I'd say if you've done a research monograph, then just have a go at finding what you think are the most user-friendly or interesting chapters of your PhD or whatever it might be, and just have a go at rewriting them for the kind of audience that you have in mind. And I'd like to have a look at that. That's useful for me to look at. It's also not a bad idea, I think, to make sure that somebody in your department who has published a monograph, or somebody in your college or wherever you are, gets a look at that proposal. They're very experienced at, they will have probably done hundreds of these things, and so do have a look. Do get them to have a look at a proposal and just see. Once you've sent your proposal to a commissioning editor, that then gets looked at by the editor, obviously, but also it might get sent out for peer review. In our case, that's sort of a process, often really just to give me a sense of whether my hunch is correct about this project. So that's a really important part of the process. It helps me think about factual accuracy, markets, contribution to the field. And also it gives you the chance to get some critical feedback, again, from people who know what they're talking about, people who will have published books. And often the feedback comes back, you know what, this is great, this will make a wonderful journal article, but I'm not sure it's a book. Or this will make a wonderful research monograph, but they've said it's an accessible book for, that's going to hit the ground running, and I don't agree. So that's sometimes what the reviewer comes back with, and that just helps my sort of thought process as I go through thinking about whether a proposal will work. If the review is negative, it doesn't mean I won't take the proposal necessarily. It might then be a process of just working with you a little bit over the coming months and just thinking, what can we do to make this work, before then we take it back to the proposal stage. And of course, the flip side to that is if the review is positive, the reviewer ultimately doesn't get the say-so on whether the book project happens. So there, the review is an advisory thing. The reviewer is not the gatekeeper, really. And so once everybody's happy with the proposal, we've talked about it in that meeting I mentioned, then we go forward, and hopefully, if we are all happy with the proposal, we would then offer you a contract. And that then is the start, really, of the process. I'm then moving with you as the author, sending you off to write, but also giving you the opportunity to come back to me. I'm reading chapters as you go, and I'm putting encouraging you to pull everything together, so that by the time we come to the date of submission, submitting the manuscript, there's enough there that we can put it through. Normally, we're talking between proposal and submitting the manuscript could be anything upwards of 6 months, and normally we would say between those are the sorts of timeframes we're talking about. So that gives you, I hope, some sort of an idea of how it all worked. And And I'm going to, I have been sent one or two questions here, which is great. Thank you so much for those. I'm going to try and get through as many of these as I can. And I'm just spooling through the ones that tell me there were also technical difficulties. If that happens, I do apologize. I hope you're able to hear as much of this as is useful to you. So somebody's asked what we need to see in a initial approach for a book and putting a PhD into a book. I hope I've covered that for you. Please do get back to me now if there's anything else you want me to cover on that. A really, really helpful question here from somebody. Is the book proposal different if I aim for both the UK and the US audience? That's an interesting question. I think one thing to be aware of is where you are envisaging your reader. If you're envisaging your reader to be somebody primarily in the States, then you're probably better off anyway looking at a US publisher. If you're thinking actually that this sort of transcends those kinds of boundaries, I don't think there'd be a great difference really from what I've already said in terms of what the proposal would look like necessarily. But you might want to highlight, I think it's really important to know if you think there is a particular reason why a book project will work really well in the States. Not because that makes me think, well, it won't work well in the UK. As I say, there are some boundaries that can be transcended, but it just helps me be aware. There is the potential, and I haven't really talked about this in what I've said, but there is always the potential to work with US publishers. We have a couple of publishers that we regularly sort of talk to and do toing and froing, and they do a US edition of and we do a UK edition, etc. So there are always those sorts of relationships. As I say, we already have a significant footprint in the US anyway, with Westminster John Knox, and that means, for example, if you're familiar with the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature big annual meeting, we are there, and we are there under the auspices of Westminster John Knox. They're always very generous with the space that they give us, and it does mean that we have a significant footprint there. I don't know whether that answered your question. If it doesn't, again, please do get back to me. That is really helpful. What if you have published some of your PhD work in 3 or 4 journal articles already? Is there still scope for publishing a book? It very much depends. I think the nature of academic publishing is that we are, the work goes in various sort of forms as it goes through. So a book may well have first appeared as a blog or as a journal article, or and a version of a chapter might appear in an edited collection. I think that's kind of a given. Obviously, it's a little different if you're repeating word for word. The key thing is to go back really to your whoever has published the journal, and check with them what they would say. But I mean, from our point of view, I would say books have a very or research has a lot of very different lives, and that's okay. I'd say particularly actually if your work has appeared in 3 or 4 journal articles, and then you produce something that's actually practitioner focused, well, that then is quite a natural movement for that piece of research, or not necessarily practitioner focused. It might just be something a little softer than your sort of hardcore hardback monograph. Yeah, it's going to have a bit of a movement anyway. You're going to have to do a lot of rewriting from an academic journal to that sort of context. So in that case, I think there's no question. Possibly if the journal was pitched at a very similar level to the chapter, or sorry, to the book, you might find that you you do need to think a little bit carefully, maybe talk, as I say, to the journal publisher and see. But I'd say plenty of books that I've been involved in have, actually as part of the proposal process, I've been sent a journal article, as a sort of demonstration of what the eventual book might look like, the kind of things it might cover. So could you elaborate more on the process of turning a thesis into a research monograph? How would a chapter read differently as a monograph? What do you need to tweak? That's a very difficult question to answer just over this medium, but I would say I think a lot of it stems from thinking about your audience. Your thesis, as I said a little bit before, I don't know if you caught it, is for your primarily your audience is your examiners, as I gather. In an ideal scenario, I'd be saying that in a room and I'd either get lots of nods or shakes of the head, but I'm going to just assume that is something that is something that you recognise, and therefore you are writing automatically for a different audience. So it might well be that there are terms in your work that you need to unpack a little bit. That doesn't necessarily mean patronize the reader. Depending on the level, you won't need to do quite as much unpacking in some sort of for some audiences as you would for others. But a little bit of unpacking of some of the terminology. I think the way you structure it's going to be different. I don't think you're going to start a book chapter with an abstract, and I don't think you're going to end the book chapter with a conclusion in quite the same way. A lot of theses I've seen the chapters start, this is what I'm going to do, and then the main body says this is me doing it, and then the end of it is and this is what I've done, and that is quite cumbersome as a book, even I would say as a research monograph. The key thing I think is that it needs to be relatively readable. I always say, because confession time, my background is not within academic theology, actually. It's a long story, but I've been doing academic theology, academic publishing for about 10 years, and probably just over half that time I've been involved in theology, and actually my academic background is literary studies. But I use that as a bit of a barometer, a bit of a benchmark, because when I'm reading a project, although I don't expect to be able to understand every moment within that project, if I can get a broad sweep, if I can summarize what it is you're trying to get at, then I think that's a useful indicator. So if I think, generally speaking, although you don't need to write down to people, you probably do need to be bearing in mind a very different audience from your research monograph. For the sample chapter, do you prefer the introduction chapter or the chapter about the major contribution of the academic field? If by the chapter about the major contribution of the academic field, you're sort of talking about a kind of you're talking about literature review, I'd say certainly that is the less helpful part of the project for me. Far more useful is an introduction. A conclusion is useful because actually, particularly in more practice-focused research, the conclusion gives you a sense of what next, or the next questions to ask, or what practical implications. It might be as I read the conclusion that I want to say to you, you know what, this is going to be wasted as a hardback research monograph. You need to do that 3 or 4 years of work, if you dare, and take that conclusion and take it where it needs to go. And actually, I think sometimes that's a more useful way to go. So the conclusion's helpful. I'd say a representative chapter somewhere in the middle. A lot of I'm thinking particularly about sort of ethnographic research. A lot of the that research seems to me to kind of gather shape, sort of maybe 2/3 of the way in. So a chapter around that is helpful. It'll differ, of course, depending on the what the project is. But so when it comes to reworking a thesis for an accessible audience, any practical tips on how to start this editorial process? Well, there we go. I would say go back to that contents. I think normally when I've been approached with a thesis, my first thing that I've said is, why don't you, having looked at it, having said, you know what, there is something here, the subject works, the topic works, go away and produce for me your fantasy contents. What would this project look like? If you could write any book based on this, what would it look like? And as you do that, try not to be wedded to the structure of the original project. It's that, and as I keep banging on about this, but as you do that, know your audience, know who you're writing for. So who do you want this project to go to? Because that will also shape that content. I'd say that is the best starting point for that process. That'll help you shape it. And the other thing I'd say, if you're saying, if your question is around reworking a thesis for an accessible audience, and actually the practice of that actual rewriting process, so that process which either takes, you know, at the very least a year and probably longer, well, almost certainly longer, I would say talk to your editor. That's kind of where the editor, where the commissioning editor can help, because they will have suggestions, and it'll differ. Of course, it'll differ depending on the project. Yeah. If there are any more questions, fire them at me now. I've come to the end of a list here. Thank you so much for all your questions. If you have any more questions, I'm going to give maybe 3 more minutes just to allow somebody to have more questions. It's slide.do and the event name is SCM Press. I really hope this has been helpful. I would say don't be afraid of approaching publishers just at a fairly early stage in your thinking. You know, even if you don't have a fully worked out sense of what the book would look like yet, don't be afraid of approaching them. And I would say, and I didn't say this earlier, and probably not every publisher would agree with me on this. I don't have a problem with authors who go to various publishers at the same time, particularly for research, scholarly research monographs. It's kind of something that is quite natural. It's a little bit different when it comes to sort of more trade popular publishing, but certainly a scholarly monograph. You know, I fully understand that you are trying to get a sense of which publishers will work for you and which won't, and I don't mind that. That's a fine thing. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has been useful. I think Sam is going to put up, or if he hasn't done already, my Twitter handle. If you're on Twitter, do go and find that. I'm at Shervington D, and also SCM Press are on Twitter, SCM_press. Do have a look at our website. At the moment, we've got a blog series called Theology in Isolation, which is an opportunity for various people just to give some of their thoughts on the back of our current situation. And it's also, I think, you know, if you're exploring, you know, ideas, you've got a sort of vague sense of where something might go, those sorts of opportunities are worth taking. So do have a look at that and read some of those entries. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to Sam at Captive North for doing all the sort of technical work in the background, so I haven't had to do anything. And have a wonderful afternoon wherever you are, and goodbye.